You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now.
Beneath the quiet streets of a sleepy town, hidden behind brick walls and sealed doors, lay a cellar that no one dared to imagine. To the neighbors, it was just another old house, a forgotten relic with creaking floors and dusty windows. But for decades, its secret festered in silence, a horror so dark that when it was finally uncovered, it sent shockwaves across the entire nation. When new homeowners began renovations, they expected to find broken pipes, maybe some old furniture, or a colony of spiders. What they uncovered instead would haunt them forever. A sealed underground chamber filled with rusted butcher's hooks, blood-stained chains, and the skeletal remains of dozens of missing persons, all pointing back to a man whose identity had long been buried in history as nothing more than a friendly local butcher. How could such evil live undetected for so long? Who were the victims, and why did no one question the disappearances that plagued the town in the 1950s? And most chilling of all, was the butcher truly acting alone? Or had his cellar been part of something far more sinister? A hidden network of crimes? Tonight, we step inside the butcher's cellar, where every brick, every stain, and every bone tells a story of horror hidden for decades. Chapter 1: The House and Its New Owners. It began innocently enough. A house worn by time sat waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. For years, the property at the end of Willow Lane had been vacant, collecting dust, ivy, and whispers. Local children dared each other to run across the overgrown lawn, but few lingered. Adults passed it with nervous glances, dismissing the unease as silly superstition. After all, it was only a house. When the Wilson family purchased it at auction, they believed they had stumbled upon a bargain. The listing had been brief: charming fixer-upper, spacious cellar, ideal for restoration. To anyone else, the cracks in the walls, the peeling paint, and the sagging roof were red flags. But to Mark and Laura Wilson, it was an opportunity. Their dream of owning a historic home finally within reach. The couple had plans. They imagined stripping the wallpaper to reveal vintage plaster, polishing the hardwood floors, and converting the old cellar into a wine room. A fresh start, Laura had called it, her voice tinged with hope as she guided their young son, Ethan, through the dim hallways. But even during those first tours, there were hints of something wrong. The air inside the house carried a weight, thick and stale, as if it hadn't been touched by sunlight in decades. Doors creaked open and shut on their own, though the family laughed it off as drafts. The cellar door was locked with a heavy padlock, unusual for an old house. But Mark saw it as nothing more than a minor inconvenience. It was the neighbor's reaction that raised the first true red flags. The Wilsons were greeted politely, but always with a trace of hesitance. When Laura mentioned their plans to renovate the cellar, Mrs. Crawford from next door visibly stiffened. "That old basement?" she muttered, eyes darting away. "Best leave it sealed, damp, full of mold. Nothing good down there, but curiosity has a way of whispering louder than warnings." The Wilsons decided to push forward. On a crisp autumn morning, Mark pried off the padlock, the clang of metal against concrete echoing through the silent house. As the door creaked open, a wave of air rolled upward, cold earthy and strangely metallic. The smell of something long hidden. The stairs were narrow, carved of stone, worn smooth in places where countless feet had once trod. Laura followed cautiously, clutching a flashlight, while Ethan stayed behind at the top step, his small voice trembling as he asked, "Daddy, what's down there?" What they saw at first seemed like any abandoned storage space. Old crates, broken furniture, a workbench covered in dust. But the further they walked in, the more the details unraveled the illusion. Hooks dangled from the ceiling. Not the kind for coats or lanterns, but thick iron hooks, rusted and jagged. Chains clinked softly in the stillness, swaying slightly as if stirred by an unseen hand. And then, in the far corner, they found it. A mound of earth, poorly concealed beneath loose boards, like a hurried attempt at burial. Mark, fueled by a mix of dread and disbelief, pulled the boards aside. What emerged from the dirt was not debris or forgotten tools. It was a bone. Long, pale, unmistakable. A human femur. Laura's scream cut through the silence, sharp and ragged as she dropped the flashlight. Its beam rolled across the cellar floor, illuminating more shapes, more fragments. A skull grinned from the dirt, teeth intact, eye sockets hollow. And beyond it, scattered like puzzle pieces, lay the remains of not one, but many. The Wilsons stumbled backward, hearts pounding, the air suddenly suffocating. In their hands, the dream of a historic home turned into a nightmare. They had not uncovered a cellar meant for wine or storage or forgotten relics. They had unearthed something far older, far darker, a crypt of horrors. The police arrived within the hour, sealing off the house with yellow tape. Neighbors gathered, whispering in clusters, their faces pale but unsurprised. And for the Wilsons, the nightmare had only just begun, because the bones in the cellar were not merely evidence of death. They were the opening chapter in a story that stretched back decades, tied to a man the town once trusted with their meals, their families, and their secrets, a man known simply as the Butcher. Chapter 2. The Butcher's reputation in town. To understand the horrors uncovered in the cellar, we must step back in time, decades before the Wilson family ever set foot in the house. Back to the 1950s, when the town thrived on small businesses, church gatherings, and a strong sense of community. And at the heart of it all was Harold Kemp, the town's butcher. On the surface, Harold was the embodiment of trust. His shop, Kemp's Quality Meats, stood proudly on Main Street, a red and white awning shading the glass cases filled with cuts of beef, pork, and poultry. Families lined up outside his door on Saturdays, and customers swore by the tenderness of his steaks, the richness of his sausages. Mothers sent their children to fetch orders, confident that Harold would always slip in an extra slice of ham or a sweet for the little ones. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, with a booming laugh that carried across the shop. He knew everyone by name, their favorite cuts, their family stories, even their secrets. People trusted Harold. They confided in him during casual conversations at the counter, believing him to be a kind listener. But behind that smile, Harold carried shadows. He lived alone in the old house on Willow Lane, inherited from his father. No wife, no children, though many wondered why. He was friendly but guarded, his personal life a mystery. At night, while the town slept, faint lights were seen flickering from the cellar windows. Some said he was simply preparing meat late into the evening, a hard-working man devoted to his craft. Others whispered darker suspicions. But in a town where appearances mattered, rumors were easily dismissed. What no one connected at the time was the pattern of disappearances that haunted the town during Harold's years at the shop. Young women vanishing after late shifts, drifters who never made it to the next town, families who reported missing relatives, only to have their cases quietly fade into unsolved archives. The local authorities chalked it up to runaway teens, transient workers, or domestic troubles. Few wanted to believe the danger lurked among their own neighbors. After all, who would suspect the man slicing roasts and chatting about baseball scores behind the butcher's counter? And yet, there were signs. A blood-stained apron hung too long on his backroom door. Deliveries made at strange hours. The way Harold would sometimes linger, staring a little too intently at the young women who visited his shop. But these details, unsettling as they were, never quite crystallized into proof. What solidified Harold's place in the community was his generosity. He donated cuts of meat to church events, provided meals for struggling families, and even sponsored the town's baseball team. He was the butcher everyone knew and, most importantly, trusted. So when his shop abruptly closed in the late 1960s, few asked questions. Harold claimed he was retiring, though still relatively young. He retreated into his house on Willow Lane, shutters drawn, windows clouded with dust. The once lively butcher was now a recluse. Townsfolk speculated that age or illness had forced him into seclusion, but in truth, Harold's silence hid something much darker. As years passed, the disappearances stopped, and memories of those lost faded into whispers. The house became just another relic of the past, until it was eventually abandoned altogether. No one dared enter, except for the occasional daring child or wandering vagrant. By the 1980s, it was nothing more than a ghost on the street. What no one realized was that beneath their feet, under the floorboards, beyond the padlocked door, the truth waited patiently. Harold's cellar was more than a workspace. It was a chamber of horrors, meticulously designed to serve his darkest appetites. When the Wilson family uncovered the bones decades later, they weren't just disturbing a burial site. They were exposing the carefully concealed legacy of a man the town had once trusted with their very sustenance. And the question loomed heavily over the investigation. How many lives had been claimed in the butcher's cellar? And how had he managed to keep his secret hidden for so long? Chapter 3: The First Victims and Vanishing Acts. The 1950s may have been an era of optimism in the small town, but it was also the time when shadows began to creep beneath its cheerful surface. The first of the disappearances was Clara Evans, a 19-year-old waitress who worked the late shift at the diner on Main Street. Clara was known for her bright smile and her dreams of leaving the small town for a bigger city. One summer night, she clocked out just past midnight, waved goodbye to the cook, and vanished into the humid darkness. She never made it home. Her family plastered her photo on every telephone pole and store window. Neighbors organized search parties, combing the woods, the riverbanks, and abandoned barns. But nothing turned up. Police speculated she had run away to chase her city dreams. Her mother insisted otherwise. Clara never would have left without her suitcase or her treasured locket, left behind on her nightstand. A year later, it happened again. This time it was Thomas Burke, a drifter passing through town. He was last seen leaving Harold Kemp's butcher shop with a paper-wrapped package under his arm. Witnesses remembered Harold shaking his hand at the door, laughing heartily as Thomas walked away. That was the last anyone saw of him. More names soon followed. Eleanor Price, a schoolteacher who vanished on her walk home. David Miller, a farmhand whose horse returned without him. Mary Collins, a widow who lived alone on the outskirts of town. Each case carried the same haunting pattern. Sudden disappearance, no trace left behind, no body ever recovered, the town whispered. Some suspected a killer, others blamed bad luck or fate. Police insisted there was no connection. They filed each disappearance separately, never tying them to a single thread. But behind the butcher's shutters, the truth was taking shape. What none of the townspeople knew was that Harold Kemp had begun perfecting a ritual. Victims were carefully chosen, those who wouldn't be missed quickly, those with routines he could predict. He lured them in with small acts of kindness, a late-night offer of food, a friendly invitation to help with a delivery, or sometimes nothing more than a ride home offered on a rainy night. The cellar beneath his house was no ordinary basement. It was a hidden chamber, reinforced with brick and lined with hooks, chains, and drains carved into the floor. The tools of his trade as a butcher became the tools of his crimes. In silence, beneath layers of earth, Harold carried out his brutal acts, ensuring that no sound escaped into the world above. And yet, small cracks in the mask began to show. A child swore she saw a woman's shoe lying in the mud near Harold's property. Another time, a hunter in the woods stumbled upon a bloodied apron discarded in a ditch, though he assumed it was simply a butcher's rag. The sheriff's office received these reports, but each was dismissed. After all, Harold was a respected man, a community figure. How could he be responsible for such things? By the mid-1960s, the list of missing persons had grown long enough that townsfolk no longer spoke of them openly. It was too frightening, too shameful to admit their little town might harbor a predator. Families locked their doors earlier, young women avoided walking alone, and rumors took the place of answers. But in Harold's cellar, the truth multiplied. Each victim added to the hidden collection beneath the floor. Each disappearance tightened the noose around the town's ignorance. Decades later, when those bones were finally unearthed, investigators pieced together the grim timeline and realized Clara, Thomas, Eleanor, David, Mary, and perhaps many more had all found their final resting place in the butcher's cellar. The most chilling detail, however, was not the number of bones found, but how meticulously they had been arranged, as if Harold had wanted his victims remembered not as individuals, but as pieces of his private, monstrous gallery. Chapter 4. The House After Harold's Disappearance. Harold Kemp did not leave town with a bang. He faded, the way a stain seeps into wood grain until it's simply part of the floor. One spring morning in 1969, a handwritten note appeared on the butcher shop door, closed for health. And by the end of the week, the windows were papered over from the inside. The striped awning frayed through one winter, then another, and the smiling man behind the glass case slipped into memory like yesterday's newspaper. He locked Willow Lane, too. Neighbors remember seeing him less and less on the front steps. He stopped waving. Curtains stayed drawn. On humid nights, a dim orange glow pulsed behind the cellar grates, as if a lantern had been left burning far below. There was an odor, faint and metallic, that folks chalked up to old pipes and a damp foundation. That house always smelled wrong, Mrs. Crawford would say decades later, arms crossed tight. Like a storm cellar after the storm, by autumn of '71, Harold was gone. No forwarding address, no goodbye. The deed taxes began to lapse. Then a relative from 2 counties over filed a probate claim and failed to appear for the hearing. Paperwork piled into the quiet bureaucracy that shields so many things from daylight. The house entered that strange civic purgatory, owned by someone on paper, tended by no one at all. You might expect a place like that to attract squatters. Willow Lane didn't. Children dared one another to run up and touch the porch rail, but even the bravest skittered away the moment their fingers brushed the peeling paint. Teens told ghost stories about a butcher who worked by moonlight. A few swore they'd seen a shadow drift past the parlor window, broad-shouldered and hatless, even though no one had lived there for years. Every few seasons, some minor emergency nudged the house toward discovery, and every time, the town stepped back from the edge. In '74, a hurricane remnant swelled the creek and flooded several basements on the block. City pumps groaned into the night, their hoses snaking down stairwells, pulling up brown water that stank of rot and iron. At Willow Lane, the maintenance crew found the exterior bulkhead bolted from the inside. They drilled, forced it, and opened 2 inches before something inside seized the door like a jaw. "Silt," the foreman muttered. "Whole place is jammed." They set a suction head at the threshold and moved on. In '78, the utility company dispatched a meter man to check a suspected leak. He tapped pipes in the crawl space and heard a hollow ring beneath the kitchen floor, a void where there shouldn't be. The technician scribbled a report. Hidden subchamber, possible cistern, no immediate hazard. The note made it to a clerk's desk, and from there to a box. The box went to storage. The storage moved to the annex when the city renovated, and the annex, eventually, was decommissioned and sent to the landfill. The house kept its silence. In '83, a stray dog padded up onto the porch with something long in its mouth. A boy on a bike saw it first and shrieked. Mrs. Crawford came running, snatched the thing with a broom, and flung it into a yard waste bin. "Dear bone," she told herself, the way people choose the gentlest truth available. She double-bagged the bin that week. There were visitors, once or twice. Not kids with flashlights. Men in dark coats who came on overcast afternoons, parked at the curb without mounting the walk, and studied the eaves like surveyors. One lifted a camera and snapped 3 quick frames of the foundation vents, then drove off. Their license plate numbers meant nothing to anyone on Willow Lane, and by the time gossip grew teeth, the men were gone. The structure sagged through the 1990s. A city inspector cited loose shingles, leaning gutters, and inward bowing of the dining room wall. He measured the cellar door and found it had been painted shut. The padlock's shackle rusted solid into a ring like a scab. He wrote unsafe for occupancy and recommended boarding the lower windows until the estate settled. It did not. Boards went up. The padlock, scab, and all remained. If you ask the old-timers about the house, they'll give you a handful of small, sharp details that don't quite fit together until you turn them in your palm. A shy altar boy who swore he heard chain clinks on an August noon while cutting through the side yard. A carpenter hired to estimate repairs in '97, who pried up a soft spot near the back hall and found a second layer of planks beneath, newer wood over older scars. A perfumed letter postmarked in 1956 discovered behind a foyer baseboard, its corners gnawed by mice. "I cannot meet you there again," it read, looping handwriting sloping down. "Please do not ask me." After 2001, the city finally moved to clear title. Legal notices ran in tiny print, as helpless as whispers. When no heirs came forward, the property went to auction. No serious bidder touched it. They said the foundation was bad. They said the neighborhood had changed. What they meant was, we have learned to sense without naming when something wants to stay buried. But neglect isn't a permanent seal. Houses rot and tell on themselves. One winter, a length of plaster peeled from the dining room ceiling like bark. Underneath, a grid of hairline cracks and a dark stain flowered outward. In the spring thaw, that stain bloomed again along the baseboard in the hallway and crept toward the kitchen, as if drawn by gravity to a point. When the Wilsons toured the property years later, Laura paused there and said she smelled something, like pennies and wet rope. Mark laughed and said old houses have old smells. The realtor jingled keys and pointed at crown molding. To understand how Harold kept the cellar hidden for so long, you have to see the house as he did. Not as shelter, but as instrument. He added a false pantry wall that matched the wainscoting perfectly. Behind it, a narrow passage to a dead zone between joists. He set the cellar light switch in a blank plate 3 rooms away, so anyone who turned the easy switch near the stair would only illuminate a decoy bulb over an empty shelf. He hung a rack of rusted tools on the inside of the door so that anyone forcing it would hear clatter, assume junk, and quit. He layered noise and misdirection the way a butcher layers fat and lean to hide gristle, and he relied on people to do what people do: assume, defer, hurry past. When something felt wrong, they grabbed the gentlest version of the truth. Old house, they said. Damp. Vermin. Not my business. Once, just once, the silence almost broke. In 1962, a woman named Eleanor Price failed to show up for class. 2 days later, her sister went to Willow Lane because someone at the grocer had said they'd seen Eleanor speaking to Harold after Vespers. The sister knocked, waited, knocked again. She took 1 step toward the side yard and heard something below. A sing-song hum, 3 notes, repeated. She ran instead of listening. In later years, she told herself it was the wind under the eaves, and by the time she stopped telling herself, it no longer mattered. What remained inside the house through all those interludes were the minute logics of a man who understood cuts and weight and the useful angles of a hook. On a shelf near the basement stairs, under a drop cloth and a varnish-crusted brush, lay a stack of carbon paper receipts from an equipment supplier 2 towns over. Industrial hooks, galvanized chain, drain grate, custom dimensions. Tucked into the ledger was a single index card on butcher's craft, penciled in a blocky hand. Inventory to be washed at night. Deliveries rear alley, no questions. The card yellowed and softened and drifted into the crack between the shelf and the wall, and no one saw it again until the remodelers lifted the shelf and the world tilted. When the Wilsons pried open the padlock, they weren't just breaking a seal. They were puncturing an atmosphere that had been self-contained for half a century. The air that rolled up, earthy, cold, faintly metallic, was time itself, unspooling. You could argue that the town failed, that the clerk should have followed the meterman's note, that the inspector should have cut through paint and chain, that the flood crew should have insisted the bulkhead come fully open. You could argue, too, that people did what people always do around evil that looks like a neighbor. They filed it under later and prayed it would file itself away. Houses remember. They hold the temperature of secrets long after the body heat is gone. So when the police tape fluttered across the porch rail in the autumn wind, the block fell quiet in a new way. Not the wary hush of superstition, but the tight, rattled silence of recognition. The Wilsons' dream of crown molding and wine racks collapsed into headlines, sirens, and white tents. The place that had been everyone's uneasy punchline turned into evidence. Inside, the detectives moved like archaeologists through a long-buried city. They found the false wall, the decoy switch, the ledger paper gone brittle with decades. They photographed every stain, every chain link. They mapped the cellar like a crime scene and like a chapel. By the time the vans rolled out, the narrative the town had rehearsed for half a century, the one about a lonely man retiring, a house that just went bad, a neighborhood superstition, had been retired for them. In its place rose the harder story the house had been trying to tell with every odor, every flood stain, every hollow knock. There was a room under our feet, and it was busy for years. What came next would pull names back from the margins, stitch timelines, and pry apart the legend of the friendly butcher from the logistics of his cruelty. But for an hour that first night, standing on Willow Lane with blue lights washing the clapboards and a cold wind in the trees, the only truth anyone could hold without dropping it was this: the house had waited, and it had not waited alone. Chapter 5. The forensic excavation. The cellar was no longer a mystery sealed by brick and darkness. It was now a crime scene. When the new homeowners stumbled upon the hidden door and alerted the authorities, the discovery sparked one of the most extensive forensic excavations the small town had ever seen. Investigators arrived with floodlights, ground-penetrating radar, and a team of crime scene technicians trained to unearth secrets buried beneath layers of time. The air inside the chamber was suffocating, heavy with damp rot and rust. Chains dangled from beams like grotesque ornaments. The concrete floor bore strange stains, long faded but still recognizable to trained eyes as traces of human blood. Forensic teams marked every inch of the cellar with numbered flags, creating a grim map of horrors. Each discovery told its own story. Fragments of bone wedged in cracks, a rusted knife concealed behind loose bricks, even fingernail scratches etched into the wall. Desperate marks of resistance that had outlived their makers. Excavation began slowly. Every bone fragment was bagged and tagged. Forensic anthropologists carefully reconstructed skeletons, laying them out on sterile tables in makeshift tents erected above the property. As the weeks stretched on, the cellar yielded its grim harvest. Not one body, not two, but dozens. Male and female, young and old. Some were whole skeletons, others partial remains, dismembered and scattered. Forensic analysis revealed cut marks that matched butchering techniques, confirming what many had begun to whisper. Harold Kemp had used his trade to disguise his crimes. Among the remains, a shocking detail emerged: patterns of arrangement. Bones were not simply discarded, they were placed deliberately, often grouped in unsettling formations. One corner contained a cluster of skulls, aligned neatly in rows as if on display. Another section held bones stacked in layered piles, like grotesque archives. Investigators debated whether this indicated ritualistic behavior or simply a methodical way of concealing evidence. Either way, it revealed chilling intent. The excavation also produced personal effects. A locket inscribed with initials, later matched to Clara Evans, the young waitress who vanished in the 1950s. A cracked pair of eyeglasses belonging to Eleanor Price, the missing schoolteacher. Buttons, shoes, scraps of fabric, even a faded grocery receipt tucked into the pocket of a victim's coat. Each item reanimated an old case file, giving names back to bones that had waited in silence for decades. The forensic breakthroughs didn't stop at identification. Advanced DNA analysis connected remains to living relatives who had long since given up hope. Families were notified one by one, reopening wounds but also providing long-delayed closure. For some, the revelation brought answers. For others, only new torment. The realization that their loved ones had not run away, had not simply disappeared, but had met their end in that cellar, deepened the horror. Investigators also reconstructed the logistics of Harold's methods. Blood spatter patterns, drainage channels in the floor, and residue on old butcher's tools painted a vivid picture of how he had carried out his killings. Experts concluded that Harold had developed a routine: immobilize, butcher with precision, and dispose beneath his own home, hiding in plain sight. What stunned investigators most was the scale. Estimates suggested at least 30 victims, though the true number might never be known. Decades of soil shifting, water damage, and decomposition had erased parts of the record. Some remains were so fragmented that they could not be tied to any single missing person. The cellar was not just a burial site. It was a mass grave. The excavation became national news. Reporters crowded the small town, broadcasting images of evidence bags, skulls lined on tables, and detectives solemnly carrying boxes of remains. The butcher's cellar became a chilling symbol of how evil can lurk undetected for generations. But the most haunting question remained. What happened to Harold Kemp? The butcher himself had vanished years earlier, leaving behind no body, no grave, no clear trail. Was he dead, having escaped justice in life? Or had he simply melted into anonymity, never far from the crimes he left behind? As the forensic excavation closed and the cellar was sealed for good, investigators were left with more than bones. They had a portrait of a predator who blended into his community, whose horrors lived beneath the feet of unsuspecting neighbors for decades. But without Harold himself, justice felt unfinished, like a story missing its final chapter. And so, the hunt shifted. From the cellar to the archives, from bones to paper trails, the next stage of the investigation began. Finding the man who built the cellar of nightmares. Chapter 6. Tracing the butcher's past. With the cellar excavated and the remains catalogued, investigators turned their focus toward the man at the center of it all. Harold Kemp, the unassuming butcher who had vanished decades earlier. Forensic science had exposed his crimes, but the man himself remained a ghost. To truly understand the scale of the horror, detectives needed to unravel his past, tracing every step of his life to see how a trusted tradesman had concealed a killing ground beneath his own home. A quiet man in plain sight. In the 1940s and 1950s, Harold Kemp was known as the local butcher. He was polite, reserved, and almost painfully ordinary. Neighbors remembered him as the kind of man who kept to himself. His shop stood on the corner of Main Street, with neatly arranged cuts of meat in the window and a friendly smile for regulars. But beneath that routine facade was something darker. Records showed repeated complaints of strange smells near his property and whispers about women who were last seen speaking with him. At the time, no one dared accuse him directly. In a small town, suspicion could ruin a man's livelihood, and Harold always seemed to have an explanation: financial trails and dark purchases. When investigators pulled old financial records, disturbing details surfaced. Harold purchased excessive amounts of cleaning chemicals, industrial-strength lime, and even surgical equipment that far exceeded the needs of a butcher's shop. His bank statements showed unexplained withdrawals on the very nights when disappearances occurred. For the first time, a pattern began to emerge. Harold was methodical not only in killing, but in concealing his tracks, the vanishing act. Perhaps the most baffling part of Harold's story was his disappearance. In 1962, shortly after the last known victim went missing, Harold closed his butcher shop without warning. The windows were boarded, the closed sign hung indefinitely, and Harold himself was never seen again. Some townsfolk believed he had fled after losing his wife to illness. Others suspected he had simply grown tired of the trade and moved elsewhere. But now, with the cellar exposed, investigators realized his disappearance was likely part of the cover-up. Did he sense discovery was near? Or had he been helped to vanish by someone else? A web of connections. Digging deeper, detectives uncovered connections between Harold and several prominent figures in the community. He supplied meat not only to families, but to local officials, police officers, and even the church. His network of trust ran deep. Some files suggested that complaints about missing persons were quietly dismissed, with law enforcement assuming runaways rather than foul play. Was Harold protected by his relationships? Or did people simply refuse to believe that evil could come from someone so ordinary? Family secrets. The Kemp family itself held unsettling clues. Interviews with distant relatives revealed that Harold's father had been a slaughterhouse worker with a history of violence. Rumors circulated of strange rituals in the family, involving animals and midnight gatherings. While no concrete evidence was found, psychologists studying the case suggested Harold's obsession with death and butchering could have been nurtured from a young age. One chilling detail surfaced. Harold's mother once reported her son, as a boy, loved to watch things bleed. Theories of escape. As investigators pieced together Harold's movements, they considered several theories. One suggested he had escaped to Canada or South America, adopting a new identity. Another believed he may have died shortly after fleeing, his body buried in an unmarked grave. Yet another theory posited that Harold never truly left, that he lived quietly under a false name in the very same region, perhaps watching the world forget his crimes. The legacy of fear. Even decades later, townsfolk who remembered Harold spoke in hushed tones. To them, he was no longer the butcher with neat aprons and a tidy shop, but a figure of nightmares, a man who could slaughter animals by day and humans by night, blending one horror seamlessly into the other. His cellar was not only a crime scene, it was a symbol of how evil can masquerade as ordinary. As the investigation into Harold's past deepened, the chilling realization set in. The cellar may not have been his only killing ground. Other missing persons cases from nearby towns bore striking similarities. The scope of Harold's crimes could stretch far beyond the cellar, perhaps even across state lines. The manhunt for Harold Kemp was no longer about solving one cellar full of horrors. It was about uncovering the full breadth of his darkness. And with every file opened, every trail pursued, one question grew louder. Did Harold act alone, or was there someone else still out there? Chapter 7. The Survivors and Witnesses. When the media broke the story of the butcher's cellar, calls and letters poured into the police station. Some were from grieving families of the missing, desperate for closure. Others came from people who claimed they had once crossed paths with Harold Kemp and survived. These voices, scattered across decades, painted a disturbing picture of a predator who stalked in plain sight. Narrow escapes. One woman, now in her 70s, recalled being a teenager working at Harold's shop in 1958. She remembered how Harold insisted she accompany him to the basement late one evening to fetch supplies. Something in his eyes made me refuse, she told detectives. I can't explain it, but I felt if I went down there, I wouldn't come back. At the time, she dismissed the feeling as childish fear. Decades later, she realized she may have saved her own life. Another account came from a traveling salesman who had visited Harold's shop one stormy night. He claimed Harold invited him to stay for supper when the roads were blocked. The man agreed, but left after noticing odd stains on Harold's apron and a heavy iron hook leaning by the kitchen table. He had this way of smiling, the salesman recalled, like he was waiting for something. Fragments of memory. Many of the testimonies were vague, clouded by time and memory. Some insisted they heard screams near Harold's house on summer nights. Others recalled seeing him carry heavy sacks into his cellar long after the shop had closed. At the time, no one dared question him. It was easier to assume he was disposing of spoiled meat than to imagine anything darker. A surviving victim? Perhaps the most chilling testimony came from a man in his 60s who claimed he had once been lured into Harold's home as a boy. He remembered being offered candy, then waking up tied to a chair. He was sharpening knives in front of me, the man said, his voice shaking. I thought I was going to die. By some miracle, Harold was distracted by a knock at the door. giving the boy enough time to slip free and escape through a window. Terrified and disbelieved, he never told anyone until decades later. Investigators couldn't verify every detail of his story, but the fear etched into his words lent it weight. If true, this man may have been Harold's only known surviving victim. The town's complicity. What struck investigators most was how many people had noticed strange things about Harold, but had chosen silence. In a small town where gossip could ruin reputations, few dared accuse him openly. The missing were explained away as runaways, drifters, or women who had gotten into trouble. The butcher's quiet demeanor and respected trade provided the perfect cover. We all felt something was wrong, one elderly resident admitted, but no one wanted to believe it. Maybe we didn't want to see. The weight of silence, for survivors and witnesses, speaking out after so many years, carried its own burden. Some felt guilty, wondering if they could have prevented deaths by voicing their suspicions sooner. Others struggled with nightmares, haunted by half-remembered encounters and the knowledge that they had brushed shoulders with a killer. Psychological analysis. Experts brought in by investigators noted that Harold's behavior matched patterns of predatory killers who rely on manipulation and social camouflage. By presenting himself as a harmless tradesman, he lulled people into lowering their guard. Those who sensed danger often couldn't articulate why, only that something in his manner felt wrong. This unease, ignored for decades, became another silent accomplice to his crimes. Echoes of fear. Even after the cellar was emptied, its victims identified, and Harold's name exposed, survivors spoke of an enduring fear. Sometimes, one elderly woman whispered, "I still dream I'm in that cellar, waiting for him to come back." For them, the butcher's cellar was not just a crime scene frozen in time. It was a scar etched into their memories, one they would carry to the grave. And yet, their voices also served as a beacon for the investigation. With each testimony, investigators pieced together Harold's methods, motives, and opportunities. The story of the cellar was no longer confined to the dead. It lived on through the living. Witnesses who had unknowingly stared into the eyes of a killer and walked away. Chapter 8. The Trial That Never Happened. When investigators finally unraveled the horrors of Harold Kemp's cellar, there was one glaring absence: the man himself. Kemp had vanished decades earlier, his death presumed but never confirmed. Without a body to prosecute, there could be no trial, no courtroom reckoning, no cross-examination, no chance for victims' families to see justice carried out. The empty defendant's chair. Reporters swarmed the courthouse on the first day authorities were expected to announce charges. The atmosphere was tense, the air brimming with expectation that the town's darkest secret would finally be laid bare. But instead of a trial, the district attorney delivered a haunting statement. Harold Kemp was legally dead. Without a living defendant, the justice system could only declare him guilty in the court of history, not law. Families wept openly on the courthouse steps. "We waited 60 years for this moment," said one relative of a missing girl, "and all we get is silence. No verdict, no punishment, the trial of evidence." In place of a legal proceeding, investigators staged a public inquest, a display of evidence for both families and the press. Photographs of the cellar lined the walls. Butcher's hooks, bone fragments, blood-stained aprons, and rusted tools. Forensic experts explained how they tied DNA to long-missing individuals. Historians described how Harold operated in a post-war era when record-keeping was lax and suspicion scarce. It felt like a trial, but with no jury and no sentence. The public was left to be both judge and jury, while the accused remained forever beyond their reach. The frustration of law. Legal scholars weighed in, noting that Kemp's case was one of many where the dead escaped the scales of justice. Without a defendant, prosecutors can't file charges. Without charges, there is no conviction. The law, they argued, was not built to punish the dead. Even when the crimes live on in undeniable evidence, some families demanded that Kemp be tried posthumously, as had occurred in rare historical cases. Others wanted his property seized, his name struck from public records, his shop demolished. In their eyes, justice wasn't just about punishing a man. It was about erasing his shadow from their community. Authorities compromised by designating Harold Kemp's house and cellar as a permanent crime exhibit, a chilling reminder of the lives lost and the decades of silence that allowed them to be hidden. A courtroom that never came. For the town, the absence of a trial was as haunting as the cellar itself. People had prepared for testimony, for the slow unraveling of lies, for the moment a guilty verdict would echo through the chambers. Instead, they got unanswered questions. Where had Harold gone? Did he die peacefully in some distant country, far from the bones he left behind? Or was he still alive, hiding in plain sight under a different name? The verdict of history. Ultimately, Harold Kemp was condemned not by law, but by legacy. The phrase, "the butcher's cellar," became synonymous with horror, invoked in documentaries, crime textbooks, and whispered conversations. His crimes lived on, not in a courtroom transcript, but in the stories survivors told and the nightmares families carried. In the end, the trial never happened, but the punishment was eternal. Harold Kemp's name would never again be spoken without fear, revulsion, and the memory of the cellar that bore witness to his cruelty. Chapter 9. The Myths, Theories, and Conspiracies. The butcher's cellar was more than a crime scene. It became a breeding ground for speculation. With Harold Kemp never standing trial and the cellar revealing more questions than answers, the vacuum of truth invited a storm of myths, theories, and conspiracies that still echo today. Did Harold act alone? One of the most enduring theories was that Harold was not the sole architect of the cellar's horrors. The scale of the crimes, dozens of victims spanning decades, seemed too vast for a single man. Conspiracy theorists argued that Kemp might have been part of a larger underground network, perhaps tied to organized crime or even a cult. The presence of strange markings on the cellar walls fueled rumors of ritualistic killings. The cult hypothesis. Some claimed the hooks and chains weren't just practical tools, but ceremonial instruments. Local legends whispered about a Red Order, a secret society that allegedly thrived in post-war Europe, blending butcher's work with occult rites. No evidence ever substantiated this, but the idea spread like wildfire through books, forums, and late-night radio shows. The government cover-up theory. Others believed Harold's cellar had been deliberately overlooked by authorities. Why had missing persons cases been brushed aside for so long? Could law enforcement have known but turned a blind eye? Some went as far as to accuse intelligence agencies of protecting Harold, suggesting he might have once been an informant or wartime operative. In this theory, the cellar wasn't just a private dungeon. It was a state secret buried beneath decades of silence. Survivors and imposters. Another strange thread came from alleged survivors. Over the years, individuals surfaced claiming they had escaped Harold's cellar. Their stories ranged from plausible to absurd. Secret tunnels, bribed accomplices, even encounters with Harold in disguises. Most were debunked, but their testimonies added to the eerie fog of uncertainty. Even more bizarre were imposters claiming to be Harold himself. Online message boards occasionally lit up with confessions from supposed Kemp lookalikes, some accompanied by grainy photos. None were ever verified, but each reignited the debate. Was Harold truly dead? The paranormal spin. As with any enduring mystery, paranormal explanations crept in. Some locals swore the cellar was cursed. Renovation crews refused to step inside after hearing phantom footsteps and whispers. Paranormal investigators recorded EVP sessions that allegedly captured voices pleading, "Let us out." Whether tricks of acoustics or something more sinister, the cellar became a hotspot for ghost hunters. The academic lens. Meanwhile, criminologists painted a different picture. Harold was a product of his environment, not a cultist or spy. They argued that his crimes flourished because of systemic failures, poor record-keeping, marginalized victims, and a culture of silence. To them, the conspiracies obscured the more disturbing truth. Harold didn't need accomplices or occult powers. He thrived because no one stopped him. Why conspiracies endure? Ultimately, the myths surrounding the butcher's cellar persist because the story lacks a final chapter. With no trial, no confirmed death, and gaps in the timeline, the human mind fills the void with speculation. The cellar isn't just a crime scene. It's a canvas where fear paints whatever shape it chooses. And yet, somewhere between cult rumors, government cover-ups, and ghost stories, one chilling truth remains undeniable. Beneath those floorboards, real lives were lost, and their echoes will never fade. Chapter 10. Legacy of the Butcher's Cellar. The Butcher's Cellar no longer exists in its original form. After years of investigation, excavation, and controversy, the property was eventually sealed, its walls reinforced, and its doors barred. Yet in a way, the cellar has never been more alive, not with flesh and blood, but with memory, fear, and fascination. A place of shadows, locals still avoid the street where Harold Kemp's home once stood. Children whisper dares to approach the boarded house, while older residents cross the street rather than walk past. For many, the cellar remains a scar, not just on the land, but on the psyche of the town. They call it the House of Echoes, believing the cries of the forgotten still reverberate in the soil. Cultural impact. The case seeped into popular culture. Books, documentaries, podcasts, and dramatizations all retold the horrors of the cellar. Some sensationalized the tale, focusing on hooks and chains, while others humanized the victims, giving voice to the silenced. Independent filmmakers even recreated the cellar as a horror set, blurring the line between entertainment and tragedy. Critics asked, was this honoring the dead or exploiting them? Lessons in justice. Law enforcement, on the other hand, used the case as a cautionary tale. Training programs highlighted how decades of ignored disappearances allowed Harold to continue unchecked. The cellar became a grim symbol of systemic negligence, a reminder of what happens when the vulnerable are forgotten and small-town whispers go unheard. Families left behind. For the victims' families, the cellar is both a curse and a grave. Many never received full answers. No names carved in stone, no certainty about the fates of their loved ones. For them, justice was incomplete. And yet, even partial closure brought some measure of peace. The cellar, for all its horrors, forced the world to acknowledge their suffering. The enduring mystery, but the unanswered questions still linger. Was Harold truly the sole architect of the cellar's terror? Was he buried under an alias, or did he vanish to continue his crimes elsewhere? Every decade, new theories revive the case, and each time, the cellar is dragged back into the light, a symbol beyond crime. In the end, the butcher's cellar became more than just the site of murders. It became a metaphor for hidden evils, the horrors that thrive in silence, the secrets buried under ordinary lives, and the darkness waiting just beneath the surface of respectability. It reminds us that monsters don't always lurk in forests or alleys. Sometimes they live next door, smiling as they hand you your daily cut of meat. The cellar is gone, but its shadow endures. Decades later, people still ask the same haunting question. How many horrors in our world remain buried, waiting for someone to pull back the floorboards? And perhaps that's why the butcher's cellar still grips us. Because it's not just a story of one man's cruelty. It's a warning that beneath the calmest towns, in the quietest homes, unspeakable truths can hide for decades.